In a quiet hospital ward, where whispers replace noise and footsteps echo like secrets, an old man sat, his skin wrinkled by time, his soul weathered by war. Then, in a moment as shocking as lightning in a clear sky, a stranger's hand struck his face. No one expected what would follow. Before we start today's story, tell us where in the world are you watching from. Also, please subscribe to the channel. It will help us to bring you more inspiring stories every day. The Fluorescent. Lights buzzed softly in St. Mary's Community Hospital. Nurses moved quietly, their shoes whispering against the polished floor. At the end of the hall, in a small waiting lounge, sat Walter Hayes, 81 years old, his body frail but his spirit untouched. His weathered hands rested on a cane, his breathing steady yet shallow. To most who passed, he was just another elderly man waiting for a doctor's word. But those who looked closer could see his faded army jacket, neatly folded beside him. The patches, worn but proud, told stories of foreign lands, of gunfire, of sacrifice. Walter had once been a soldier who carried nations on his shoulders. Now he carried silence. His eyes, still sharp blue, gazed out the window where autumn leaves fell gently. He was waiting for routine results. Nothing extraordinary, but fate rarely warns us before it knocks. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, unaware that before the hour turned, this hospital would no longer be the same. The automatic doors at the front slid open with a sharp hiss. In walked Trevor Maddox, a man in his mid-30s with a presence that poisoned the air around him. Leather jacket torn at the sleeves, tattoos creeping up his neck, eyes burning with careless fire. He carried himself like trouble looking for a stage. He wasn't here for healing. He was here for attention. His boots slammed against the tiles louder than necessary, each step daring someone to challenge him. The receptionist offered a polite smile, but Trevor sneered, waving his hand dismissively. "Don't bother, sweetheart. Just tell me where I can smoke around here." His voice was brash, scraping against the sterile calm of the hospital. People shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping, their bodies shrinking from his energy. Walter noticed, his cane tapping once against the floor. He had seen men like Trevor before, angry, lost, carrying storms in their chests. But Walter also knew something else. Storms always break one way or another. A young nurse approached Trevor, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Sir, I'm sorry, but you can't smoke anywhere inside or near the entrance." Her voice was soft but steady, professional yet fragile. Trevor's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Really? What's the world coming to when a man can't light up?" He leaned in, his breath sour with tobacco, his words dripping with sarcasm. The nurse stepped back slightly, her eyes darting for safety. Walter's hand tightened on his cane. He had seen too many bullies disguise their emptiness with noise. "Young man," Walter's voice broke through, low but firm. "Respect her. She's just doing her job." The room froze. Trevor turned slowly, his head tilting like a predator sizing prey. His smirk widened into cruelty. "What's this? Grandpa wants to play hero." Walter's gaze held steady. His eyes didn't blink. "Kindness is strength. You should try it." Trevor laughed loud and sharp, the sound grating across the sterile room. "Strength? Let me show you strength." Without warning, Trevor's hand whipped across Walter's face. The crack echoed through the waiting room like glass breaking. Walter's head turned with the blow, his cheek flaring red, but his eyes, those clear, steady blue eyes, never flinched. He didn't raise his cane. He didn't curse. He simply inhaled, exhaled, and stared straight ahead. Trevor smirked, shaking his hand as if proud of the sting. "That's what kindness gets you, old man." Gasps filled the air. A mother pulled her child closer. A nurse covered her mouth. But no one moved. Silence weighed heavy, thicker than any plaster wall. Walter lifted a trembling hand, dabbed, at his lip with a tissue and whispered, "You don't know battles, son, you only know noise." Trevor scoffed, throwing himself into a chair, his arrogance filling the room. He thought he had won. But far beyond the glass doors of St. Mary's, a sound began to stir, the faint, distant growl of engines, rolling like thunder on the horizon. The hospital's waiting room sat heavy with silence, the kind that suffocates. More than noise. Walter dabbed his cheek with the tissue, the sting of Trevor's slap fading into something deeper, an ache not of the body, but of the heart. He had survived war zones, frost-bitten nights, and hunger that chewed through bone. Pain was no stranger, but humiliation delivered in a place of healing cut sharper than bullets. The young nurse lingered near him, tears threatening to spill. "Mr. Hayes, I'm so sorry." Walter gave her a faint, steady smile. "Not your fault, dear." Across the room, Trevor leaned back smugly in his chair, tossing a paper cup into the trash like a king discarding scraps. He expected fear, expected silence, and the room gave him both. Yet outside the sliding glass doors, that faint motorcycle growl swelled a little louder. Tires on pavement, engines humming like thunderclouds gathering. No one inside noticed. Yet but fate was already shifting gears, racing toward the hospital faster than anyone could imagine. A young orderly named Chris sat quietly in the corner, his eyes fixed on Walter. He had grown up hearing stories of men like Walter, heroes who carried scars the world never saw. But Chris wasn't a soldier. He was a boy of 23, shy, uncertain, his courage buried under layers of fear, his fists clenched beneath. His scrubs. He wanted to stand. He wanted to tell Trevor that striking an old veteran wasn't power, it was cowardice. Yet his legs refused to move. Trevor's laugh filled the room, bouncing off sterile walls, sharp and bitter. He leaned forward, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "See, no one's got anything to say. Guess the old fossil knows his place." Walter sipped his water slowly, his hands trembling slightly, but his dignity intact. "Respect doesn't age," he said softly, though few heard him over Trevor's arrogance. And still, outside, the rumble of engines grew closer. Dozens of them now, merging into one rolling storm headed straight toward St. Mary's. Trevor rose again, restless, searching for new prey. His boots struck the tile, each step dripping with the thrill of control. He leaned over Walter, his voice mocking. "Tell me, old man, what did the army teach you? How to take a slap?" Walter's gaze didn't waver. "It taught me how to stand tall." Trevor scoffed, but something in Walter's calm unnerved him. He turned his glare to Chris, the young orderly. "What about you, kid? You look like you want to play hero. Stand up and I'll put you down twice as fast." Chris froze, his chest tight, shame burning in him. Trevor's smirk grew wider. He thrived on silence, on shrinking souls. But as he laughed, a new sound finally pierced the hospital walls, the unmistakable roar of Harley-Davidsons filling the parking lot. The windows trembled with it. Patients turned their heads, startled. Nurses paused mid-step. Trevor's smirk faltered, just for a second. The storm had arrived, and it wasn't coming quietly. The automatic doors slid open with a rush of cold air and the thunder of boots. In walked men in leather jackets, their presence thick as smoke. At their center strode Daniel Hayes, Walter's son, a mountain of a man, his beard flecked with gray, his eyes sharp with fury. Grease still stained his hands from the repair shop he'd left behind, but his stride carried the weight of command. Behind him flowed the Hell's Angels, 100 strong, their patches gleaming, their loyalty stitched into every thread. The hospital froze, nurses clutching clipboards, patients peering around corners. Daniel's eyes scanned the room and found his father instantly. The red mark on Walter's cheek tightened his jaw like a vice. He knelt beside him, voice low but burning. "Dad, who did this? Walter's hand, frail yet firm, squeezed his son's wrist. "It's all right, son. Let it be." But Daniel's gaze had already shifted, locking on Trevor, and Trevor, for the first time, felt something foreign crawl up his spine. Fear. Trevor pushed himself to his feet, his smirk shaky but clinging like a cracked mask. "What? You brought your gang to a hospital?" His voice wavered beneath false bravado. Daniel rose slowly, towering over him, his shoulders wide as doors. The Hell's Angels stood behind him in silence, their presence enough to shift the entire balance of the room. Daniel's voice came calm, but heavy with steel. "You think you're strong because you hit an old man? That old man is my father." Trevor's smirk collapsed, his chest tightening under the weight of those words. The silence was no longer fear, it was anticipation. Chris leaned forward, heart pounding. The nurse wiped her eyes, her hope flickering alive. Daniel stepped, closer, his boots steady. "Stand up like a man if you can." Trevor's hands twitched nervously. He had built his power on silence and weakness. But now he faced an army forged not of fists, but of loyalty. The room held its breath, waiting for the truth to fall. Trevor hesitated, his chest rising fast, pride dragging him into dangerous waters. Slowly he stood straighter, forcing his smirk back onto his face. "So what? You gonna sick your biker buddies on me?" His words rang hollow, an echo of arrogance that no longer carried weight. Daniel didn't blink. His voice stayed, calm, sharp as a blade. "I don't need them to deal with you." Behind him, the Hell's Angels shifted like shadows, their silence more threatening than fists. Trevor swallowed hard, his bravado cracking at the edges. Walter lifted his cane slightly, his voice cutting through. "Son." All eyes turned. His tone was gentle, but it carried authority that silenced even engines. "Don't make this your fight. Some burdens belong only to the man who carries them." Daniel clenched his jaw, torn between fury and restraint. Trevor laughed weakly, mistaking the pause for weakness. "That's right, hide behind Daddy's wisdom." But Walter's eyes snapped up, clear and unyielding. "You mistake restraint for weakness. That's why you'll always lose." The word struck Trevor harder than any fist. His smirk faltered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Daniel's fists trembled at his sides, itching to break loose, but his father's hand, weathered and scarred, rested firmly on his arm. "Not this way, son," Walter whispered. Silence pressed against the walls, heavy, suffocating. For a moment no one dared to breathe. Then from behind the counter the young nurse spoke. Her voice shook, but her eyes did not. "Why don't you just leave?" Trevor spun toward her, fury flashing, but what he saw froze him, the courage in her gaze fragile yet unyielding. Slowly, others lifted their eyes. Chris pushed his cap back, revealing steady determination. An elderly woman in a wheelchair straightened her shoulders. One by one the room rose, not with fists but with spirit. Trevor's chest tightened, the air slipping from his lungs. He wasn't facing one veteran anymore. He was facing a room that no longer bowed. Trevor's bravado unraveled. His breathing grew shallow, his words stumbled. This doesn't mean anything." His voice cracked like glass. Walter's voice cut across the room, calm and certain. "It means everything. Respect doesn't bend to fists, it stands taller than them." The sentence struck like a gavel. Trevor turned to Walter, and for the first time saw not just an old man but a soldier who had faced death and never flinched. Daniel stepped forward, one single step, but it carried the weight of thunder. Trevor's smirk dissolved entirely, leaving only pale fear. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The Hell's Angels didn't move, didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. Trevor stood there, trembling in the silence of his own defeat. Chris leaned forward, his voice steady now. "You should go." Trevor's eyes flickered, searching for escape, but the only door in the room was the one that meant surrender. Trevor turned, his boots scraping against the floor, his shoulders heavy with humiliation. The customer's eyes followed him, not with fear anymore, but with judgment. The nurse, now steady, stood taller than before. Chris clenched his jaw, courage pulsing through him. Trevor reached the automatic doors. As they slid open, the sound outside crashed into him, the deafening roar of 100 engines idling in unison. The Hells Angels filled the parking lot like an army, their presence shaking the very ground. Trevor froze, sweat forming at his brow. He glanced back once, but no eyes offered him rescue. His boots dragged as he stepped outside. The bikers turned their heads in silence, their stares heavy as stone. He hurried across the lot, shrinking with every step, until he vanished beyond the rows of chrome and steel. Inside, the hospital exhaled all at once. The storm had passed, but the lesson remained. Walter lifted his cup of water, his hands steady. Dignity had not been broken. It had stood unshaken. Daniel slid into the chair across from his father, his chest still rising with unspent fire. He stared at the red mark on Walter's cheek, guilt tightening in him. "I should have..." Walter raised a hand gently, silencing him. "No, son, you did exactly what needed to be done." Daniel's jaw clenched, his eyes burning. "I didn't do anything." Walter's faint smile deepened. "Sometimes standing still is the hardest fight of all." The Hells Angels remained. Nearby, their leather jackets and patches gleaming under fluorescent light. Yet even they, men of grit and steel, bowed their heads with respect, not for the numbers they brought, but for the restraint Walter showed. Daniel's shoulders trembled, shame battling pride. Walter reached across the table, his grip firm on his son's hand. "The world doesn't need more fists, Daniel. It needs more hearts." The words fell heavy, not as advice, but as truth. And in that moment, Daniel realized his father's strength was not in battle scars, but in unshakable dignity. The waiting room, once suffocated by silence, began to breathe again. Conversations sparked softly, like embers catching flame. Child whispered to his mother, "He's a hero," and the mother nodded, eyes misty. The nurse returned with a fresh cup of coffee for Walter, her hands no longer trembling. "On the house," she said gently. Walter nodded, gratitude flickering in his tired smile. Daniel sat across from him, still restless, his fists unclenching slowly. Around them, the Hells Angels settled into quiet watch, not as outlaws, but as guardians. Steel and leather transformed into shields of respect. Chris stood taller now, his shame replaced with resolve. The people in that room had seen something rare, dignity defying cruelty. They would carry it like a scar, a reminder that silence could be broken, that respect could rise. Outside, engines rumbled softly, no longer threatening but protective, waiting like faithful sentinels on the road. Walter sipped his coffee, calm as ever. He had fought his battle without lifting a hand. Sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, golden and warm, spilling across the floor like a blessing. Walter turned to Daniel, his voice soft but deliberate. "A man's strength isn't measured by how hard he strikes. It's measured by what he protects." Daniel swallowed, the weight of the words sinking deep. He looked at his father, the faint bruise on his cheek, and felt both pride and sorrow. Pride for the man who had stood taller than anyone he'd ever known. Sorrow that the world was still cruel to men who carried dignity instead of fists. Walter's hand, rough yet steady, tightened on his son's. "Promise me something." Daniel leaned in, eyes misting. "Anything, Dad." Walter's gaze held firm. "When the world pushes you, don't just push back. Stand taller. That's how you honor me." Daniel nodded slowly, his jaw trembling. "I promise." The engines outside roared once, as if echoing the vow. The hospital's walls, once heavy, now seemed to stand a little taller themselves. When Walter finally stood, leaning on his cane, the entire waiting room rose with him. Not out of habit, but out of reverence. The nurse smiled, wiping her tears. Chris straightened his scrub's chest, lifted with pride. Even patients in wheelchairs wheeled forward slightly, as if saluting silently. Daniel moved to his father's side, steadying him with a hand. Together they walked toward the glass doors. The Hell's Angels fell in step, not as a mob, but as an honor guard. Leather, steel, and loyalty moved with reverence. As the doors opened, sunlight flooded the sterile floor, brighter than before, spilling warmth where fear once lingered. Walter paused at the threshold, lifting his face to the breeze. The roar of motorcycles greeted him, surrounding him like an anthem. He closed his eyes, whispering to no one but the wind. Respect always wins. Daniel looked at his father, not as a fragile old man, but as the strongest man alive. Together, they stepped forward into the light dot outside comma. The engines revved in harmony, the sound rolling like thunder across the parking lot. Patients peered through windows. Nurses stood in awe at the entrance. Walter and Daniel walked slowly between the rows of bikes, every rider nodding in solemn respect as they passed. These men, often branded by the world as outlaws, carried themselves, now as protectors of something sacred. Not revenge, not violence, but respect. Daniel's arms stayed firm around his father, though Walter's steps were steady, defiant against frailty. The rider's eyes followed him, not out of pity but admiration. For in Walter they saw something rare, a man whose dignity made him unbreakable. When they reached the end of the line, Walter lifted his cane slightly, like a salute. The roar of engines erupted in unison, shaking the very ground as if the world itself bowed. In that thunder, Trevor's slap was reduced to nothing more than a forgotten echo. Walter had already won, not by fighting back, but by standing tall. The hospital slowly returned to its rhythm, but it would never truly be the same. Every soul in that waiting room carried a story now, a story of how dignity rose above cruelty, of how silence broke into courage. Chris, the young orderly, scribbled a note later that night. "I saw a man today who didn't need fists to win." The nurse called her mother, her voice trembling as she said, "I met the bravest man alive." Even patients whispered to visitors, their eyes shining with awe. And Daniel, he carried his father's words home like scripture. He replayed the moment over and over, realizing that strength wasn't in the fire of his fists, but in the calm of his father's heart. The Hell's Angels dispersed down the highway, engines thundering, leaving behind a legend instead of a scar. And Walter Hayes. He sat quietly at home that night, his cheek still sore but his soul triumphant. Respect had stood taller than cruelty. Weeks later, the hospital staff still spoke of that day. The young nurse would tell new hires. There was an old veteran who taught us all what courage looks like. Chris, once timid, began volunteering at a local shelter, inspired by Walter's quiet strength. Daniel, whenever he rode with the Angels, rode differently, not with rage, but with purpose. And Walter, he carried on, cane tapping lightly against sidewalks, eyes still sharp, still unbroken. People who passed him on the street might never know the story, might never guess the battles he had fought with silence instead of fists. But those who had seen it would never forget. For in that sterile waiting room, an old man had reminded the world of something timeless. Cruelty shouts, but dignity whispers louder. And when the engines of loyalty rose to protect him, it wasn't vengeance they carried, it was respect. In the end, Trevor's hand had left only a bruise. Walter's spirit left a legacy. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and press the bell icon so you never miss another story that stirs the soul. Because sometimes the quietest victories leave the loudest echoes.